Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode number 7 of Reappropriate, the podcast. I'm Jen. I'm the blogger at Reappropriate, and tonight I have a very, very, very special episode of the podcast to talk to you guys about what I think is the third rail issue of Asian American politics, which is interracial relationships. And in order to tackle this huge topic, I'm really excited to bring to you guys 4 really great guests, each of whom have, I think, very interesting and very passionate opinions on the subject of interracial relationships and the AAPI community. So I have with me tonight Juliet Shen of Fascinations, KJ Park, and also Trungles. And I'm going to actually have you guys go through and introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about you. So starting with Juliet. Hi, Juliet, and welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me on again, Jen. So my name's Juliet Shen.
Thank you.
I run the blog Fascinations, which is a blog that focuses on racism, sexism, pretty much a lot of isms, and then kind of like my own personal identity, current events, and all that stuff. I also moderate the blog Angry Asian Girls United, which is a feminist blog, and I run the social media for 18 Million Rising.
Great, awesome. Thanks for joining us today, Juliet. And for those of you who are just watching, Juliet and I just finished off a really phenomenal conversation about AAPI feminism, which I thought was really, really insightful. And if you haven't had a chance yet, go check that out. Next up, I want to introduce KJ Park. Hi, KJ. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, my name is KJ Park. I am a graduate from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And while I was there, I did a lot of Asian male masculinity workshops as well as race relations workshops while I was there. So that's me.
And thanks for joining us tonight, KJ. And then finally, I want to introduce Trungles, who is really awesome for being here because Trungles actually joined us very last minute tonight. So Trungles has no idea what we're doing today, so we're kind of like
you're throwing me in the deep end here.
Yes. So, Trungles, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am a graduate of Hamline University, and I participate in a lot of their LGBT orgs and their multicultural orgs, and I was on the board for their Asian Pacific American Coalition, and I am a cartoonist. I draw, I make comics. So what do I know? No, I very much enjoy these conversations, and I consider myself to be very involved. I keep up.
So, I actually thought I'm really excited to have Trungles here. I'm excited to have all of you guys here, but Trungles in particular, I'm really happy you were able to come join us because one of the things that I was doing to prep for tonight's conversation was to download one of Juliet and Trungles' post that was on Fascination that was about interracial relationships, and it touched on a lot of really great issues I'm hoping to talk about today. So for those of you who are just joining us for the first time for the podcast, I really quickly want to give you a rundown of what you can do in order to participate in the conversation. The podcast invites live user interaction, so we're talking, but you guys can interact as well. So as we're talking, you have a couple of different ways you can send us questions. You can tweet us at @Reappropriate, which is at the bottom of the screen right now. You can also, so I'll be monitoring the Twitter and I'll be reading your tweets live if they come up. You can also interact using the question and answer app, which is on the Google Hangout bar right now. And as you do that, we will be able to see your questions and we will be able to answer them. So tonight we're talking about interracial relationships, which, like I said, is pretty much the third rail issue, I think, in AAPI politics. It's an issue that I think has been an undercurrent within Asian American identity development and consciousness raising since pretty much the start. For 30 or 40 years, it has been something that defined the legendary Maxine Hong Kingston versus Frank Chin debate of 20 years ago. It's something that continues, I think, to be an undercurrent in how we talk about and develop our identities today. And I think that there's a lot of different aspects that we can look at. So the interracial relationship issue is one that keeps coming up relative to statistics. And it all boils down to the simple observation using basically census data that within the Asian American community, there is a relatively high degree or percentage of outmarriage of Asian Americans to non-Asians. And if you disaggregate by ethnicity, that can range from something like 20% up to about 45 to 50% of Asian Americans who are not dating or marrying within their race. And it does seem to differ based on ethnicity, but it is a relatively high outmarriage rate relative to other races or ethnicities. And this has led to I think, a lot of theorizing and speculation and discussion over what that statistic really means. Another aspect of the statistic to consider is that it tends to have a gender disparity. So when you look at census data, for example, and you look at just marriage rates, this is all, of course, heterosexual marriage. That the census was recording at the time, and what you can see is that women had a higher likelihood of being within an interracial marriage than men who are Asian American. And so again, this has caused a lot of discussion, possibly even a little bit of consternation within the Asian American community. So the first question, I think the best place to start here is, why do we think that the Asian American or the interracial relationship issue is an important one, and why do we think that, and how is it important to the Asian American community? And I wonder if any of you guys have anything, like, why do we talk about this?
I'll kick it off, I guess, and also I think KJ got kicked off.
Yeah, I'm going to invite him back right now.
Okay. So I think that like interracial relationships are just such a huge topic. It's so difficult to even just kind of like find an angle to get started on, because it produces so much misogyny. First off, that's just the first thing that comes to mind for me. Interracial relationships and then the kind of territorial qualities that kind of come with them, whether it's for like Asian men in interracial relationships or Asian women in interracial relationships. There's a sense of like entitlement to the other person's attention, and it also goes into like the credibility. A lot of people who are like involved in like activism or organizing or just kind of have a presence in the community sometimes have their credibility is put into question based on their choices in their love life. So that's one, and it's just, I feel like a lot of the stereotypes that kind of carry on into the gender roles of Asian Americans are definitely in play with interracial relationships, and certainly some relationships may or may not be based off of those stereotypes.
And I think that's a really interesting point, is whether or not there's a gender power dynamic that gets placed on in the way that we perceive interracial relationships. Whether or not we sort of implicitly think about women being possessed by their men, just across the board, regardless of race, women being in a more submissive role politically. And so when we think about interracial relationships and we apply this sort of heteronormative frame or lens onto it, we are applying this assumption that the women are being appropriated or co-opted in some way by the men that they're with. And when this becomes an interracial relationship, that it's sort of an appropriation of Asian American women by non-Asian American men. And I feel like there's this this disparity in how we look at interracial relationships depending on whether or not the partner who is Asian is the female or the male. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And then also I think it definitely ties into like a lot of ideas that people have about white supremacy. A lot of people just kind of assume that the other partner in an interracial relationship is white, when I think it's extremely important to just like acknowledge that many, many, many couples out there are kind of like inter-POC.
And I think that the other major assumption that's made when we talk about the interracial relationship question is that we're not just assuming that the partner is white. I actually think that we also assume that the two partners are straight and that the two partners are cisgendered and I think American as well. And I feel like that sort of plays a role or influences the entire framework and the language that we use to discuss the topic. I think we make all of these assumptions when we talk about interracial relationships. It's sort of this dog whistle term that we're really talking about white men and Asian women, when the makeup of interracial couples are much more diverse than that. And one thing I wonder is whether or not the way that we talk about this issue is limited by the fact that we make assumptions about the kind of couple that we're talking about. And I wonder if anybody on the panel has any thoughts about that. No one? Well, so the part of the reason I wanted to ask Trungles in was because I think that you had mentioned in the conversation with Juliet, and I was trying to look for it, how you were talking about the assumption that interracial relationships are straight implicitly when we talk about them, rather than bringing in diversities of different kinds of couples. And I wonder if maybe you might want to talk a little bit about how you see the conversation maybe influenced positively or negatively by the way that that conversation is limited, and maybe expanding upon our idea of interracial relationships as being perhaps a little bit more diverse than straight white men and straight women.
Well, I think that it very much has to do with, it's sort of this double-edged sword. Like, we think about it in terms of it being a culturally like a cultural thing. Like, it exists as a part of our cultural imagination that we assume that people will be white and straight, and that, you know, in interracial relationships, at least one of the partners is going to be white. But I actually think that it has a lot to do with the legislation that has been put around it as well. Like, exclusively, like particularly within the context of the United States, anti-miscegenation laws are about the racial integrity of white people. That's what those laws are about. Like, they don't care if people of color got together and had interracial relationships. It's 1924, the Racial Integrity Act of the United States explicitly prohibits interracial marriages between people who are white and people who are not white. And so the concept that interracial dialogues being centered around individuals who are white has that sort of legislative history behind it. It explicitly talks about white people and not really anybody else. It's about the protection of whiteness. And so that's why we think about it in terms of like, oh, if you're a person of color and we're talking about interracial relationships, one of you is going to be white. And that's interesting and problematic in a lot of ways, but there is that context there. And of course, with gay marriage not being a 100% thing across the country, it's very obvious that, of course, like, legislatively speaking, people don't really consider it in terms of conversations in the way that these relationships play out within the cultural imagination, because it's not yet been legitimized by law.
Mm-hmm. And I really think that's an important point. I was sort of alluding to this earlier. Everything that we look at in terms of outmarriage statistics is limited by the fact that we're collecting census data, which is only collecting data on straight marriages right now. So we actually have no idea what the trends are in gay marriages or unmarried couples as well. And so I think that when we talk about this issue, we need to be aware of the kind of data that we're using. I actually also really wanted to pick up on your point about the legislation, Trung, because I actually think it's really important that we remember that this is all wrapped up in the discussion over interracial relationships is really about the threat that whiteness felt from men and women of color in various ways, the stereotypes that they felt, and how that plays upon our own their conceptions of our masculinities and our femininities, and our own self-identifications and conceptions of our masculinity and femininity. Like, before the 1924 Act that you cited, you know, Ron Takaki, Strangers from a Different Shore, talks about how there was just many instances documented of South Asian men who were freely marrying Mexican women during a period when miscegenation was considered taboo, at a time when the racial identity of South Asian Americans was fraught, and there was some discussion about whether or not they constituted Caucasian or not. Mm-hmm. But either way, from that perspective, a legislative perspective, it was considered not problematic because they were considered sufficiently not white and not considered marrying someone who was white to really make it a problem legislatively. So for a long period of time in the late 19th, early 20th century, South Asian American men were intermarrying with Mexican American women, and creating and finding a lot of cultural connections and stuff like that. So I really think that what we really need to draw from the example that you brought is how this is really about masculine threat or feminine threat. And one of the things that I think is really interesting in the interracial relationship issue is how issues of masculinity play into it, and how I think it informs Asian American masculinity specifically. And I wonder if, KJ, since you talked about running workshops on this issue, whether or not you had any thoughts about the intersection between Asian American masculinity and why it seemed the interracial relationship issue seems to be pretty important there.
Well, I'll say that growing up, you would see all these people as like a youth, a young man growing up. You would see all these couples getting together, whether it be interracial or like same-sex, same. Shen. Well, wait. Sorry.
No worries. It's okay.
Growing up, I would notice a lot of people getting together, getting into relationships, and for me, it was to stay with my studies, obviously. But as I was reaching puberty, I would notice that a lot of girls didn't really talk to me in a romantic sense, and I always wondered why. And it wasn't until maybe sophomore year of high school that I kind of delved into like the dating realm, and noticed that a lot of people say the phrase, or a lot of girls generally said the phrase, "I don't date Asian guys." And for a young person, it's kind of hard to hear, especially when you have like this confidence about you as a child, and then you kind of like enter this world where no one is really paying attention to you and paying attention to everyone else. So as I grew older, I kind of just started learning things like Western media kind of displaces Asian American males and then emasculates them in a way. And it kind of puts that image out there that Asian Americans or Asian American males are not, or men, sorry, Asian American men are not to be like sexualized or viewed in a romantic way.
And I find that, so I think that that's sort of what I would consider the other side almost of the interracial relationships, sort of the part that I can't personally relate to, being not a guy, but a part that I think I've experienced sort of intellectually or academically, because I think this issue has come up so often within the community that this is a point of view that is expressed a lot. And before I tackle that, one thing, because we were sort of talking about history, one thing that I find really interesting, getting back to Trungles' point about legislation, is, the 1924 Act that outlawed miscegenation was at a time when I think the stereotypes against Asian American men were completely different than they are now. At the time, Asian American men were predominantly Chinese American and Korean and Japanese American, and it was a time when the stereotype against Asian Americans was that, they were all bachelors and they were barbaric, sexually hypersexual, and sexually predatory. And one of the fears was that the Asian American man would sexually assault the pristine white woman and sully her in some way. So it was a hypersexual stereotype that was plaguing the Asian American male community, 80 years ago. And so one thing I wonder, and I'm just going to throw this out to the panel, whether you think the emasculation stereotype is a new phenomenon, and if so, why? Because I think it is a new phenomenon, but it's sort of hard to pinpoint when we suddenly flipped from being these like sexual predator stereotype to this emasculation stereotype.
So I think
it started.
I was just going to say that I think it definitely ties into like the model minority myth, like around the same time that kind of started popping up and really getting more, I guess, believed and mainstream, is like, I think at the time all men of color were kind of painted in that hyper-aggressive, hypersexual, barbaric, predator way, but then once the model minority stereotype kind of came up, they were kind of like, okay, well, we don't want to give them the good stuff, but what's another way we can keep them down but differentiate them from other men of color? So I think that's also where like emasculating Asian men came from, because you see, at least from my personal experience, I see like the majority of pop culture that kind of puts Asian men as like the sidekick, supporting role, comedic relief, the nerd, all the stereotypes, kind of more arising and like reaching a peak in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. And I'm sure there's like many more from beforehand, but I think that that's kind of really when the stereotypes started getting really flipped.
And I wonder also if it's been reinforced by like the histories of wars that the United States participates in regards to Asia, because I feel like, and it's sort of this trend, like when I was a lot younger, I sort of noticed that this, I guess, for lack of a better term, the emasculation of the Asian American male, or like Asian men in general, kind of really strongly echoes the way that the United States, like the masculinity of the United States in popular imagination feels about European men. Like there is this sense that if you are an other and you come from a place that is not here, not the United States, and you assert masculinity somehow, the U.S. is going to be the more masculine. So there's this sense that like attributing effeminate attributes to whoever is your other at the moment is going to somehow undermine their authority and position you as the kind of the power broker in whatever cultural situation you're trying to control.
Yeah, I totally agree. Go ahead, KJ.
Yeah, sorry. going back, I think it also had to do with the Red Scare. Red Scare, America was scared of communism. Asia was one of those, well, China was predominantly one of those countries moving towards that. So there's always pamphlets, flyers, propaganda flying around with caricatures of Asian people that would always make them look like a cartoon or look in a way to belittle them and to take the human characteristics out of them, and especially with Asian males, since those are the people that they were going to be fighting against. So there was that. There was also Asian immigrants that were coming into the country that were only, the males would have to work in places seeking employment in laundromats, as tailors, cleaners, cooks. Generally, back then, jobs that would be considered feminine in a way. So all those factors that pushed them into those fields emasculated them over time, and especially in media, like Julia pointed out earlier in the 80s, you have like 16 Candles, you have all these other movies like, especially Western media influence. Tokyo Drift, for instance, has a white male protagonist who somehow learns like in a week how to race better than all the other people in Tokyo, and then decides to beat all those people, and then take the Asian girl at the end. So little movies like that where there's like a protagonist of a different color coming into an Asian culture, somehow mastering stuff that Asian American or Asian males have been trying to master for centuries, all of a sudden decides to learn it in a week and beat everyone at their game and then win whatever it is at the end that they're seeking. So all those things factor into the emasculation of the Asian male. Like, I mean, it's even a subconscious thing, I feel. Like, it's a subliminal message that they always send to, like, their audience. And it makes males of Asian descent viewed as someone not powerful.
And I feel like that's, like, a really good transition to something I know Jen and I love talking about.
Juliet, I'm just really quickly going to ask, so Miles Lay is watching us right now and wanted to ask us the question whether or not Revenge of the Green Dragon, an upcoming movie, if we have any comment about that and its Asian American masculinities. I don't know what this movie is, just really quickly.
Oh, I've seen the trailer. It's like one of those like action gang movies, but featuring like all Asians.
Okay. Does anyone want to comment real quick? I imagine, personally, that it's going to be exactly like what KJ said, so I imagine that we could have just stuck Revenge of the Green Dragon into what he said because he covered it really, really well. But I also am saying that without actually having seen the trailer or knowing anything about this movie. Does anyone want to say something real quick? Or hopefully, Miles, that answers your question, and then I'll hopefully say something when I have seen this trailer. No? Okay.
Well, actually, just real quick on the topic of like Asian American masculinity, I feel like, especially in regards to this particular film, if you've seen the trailer for it, it looks exciting. You know, it's a violent action film about gangsters, but like it'll rely on the whole like probably something about triads. I don't know. I didn't pay too much attention to it. Kev Jumbo's in it somewhere. Like it's like a bunch of Asian guys with guns and there's damsels in distress and like it's just an all Asian cast and that's kind of cool and progressive in and of itself. But like at the same time, I feel like the discourse on the emasculation of the American or the Asian American male, being an Asian American male myself, has a lot to do with this reliance on the idea that white masculinity is desirable. There's so much like conversations about Asian American men. Like when we talk about like Asian American issues in regards to like gender and masculinity, we have a tendency to center it on the emasculation of Asian men, and that frames the conversation in such a way that people think that the easy way to get out of it and the easy remedy for it is to posit Asian American men as like these paradigms of masculinity, and oftentimes in the media that comes off as, oh, we can be just as misogynistic as white men. They've like created this character of like the sexy, cool Asian bro, SCAB, a scab, if you will, kind of like healing over this like wound of American like emasculation. But do you know what I mean though? It's of like Asian men trying to position themselves in roles that have been traditionally seen as roles occupied by white men. And so every time like an Asian American man becomes the romantic lead and gets the girl, and that's always the language that's used, getting the girl, like it has to do with occupying the space that a masculinity that has been exclusive to white men in the media.
Yeah, absolutely. And the question, it's so essential what you're saying about who's setting the template for what we define as masculine. And clearly the template that we as people of color are told we're supposed to pursue is this white heterosexual, highly masculine in this sort of hegemonic masculine sense, who's misogynistic, who is objectification of women. And I wrote this post maybe about 3 months ago now that posited this idea of this term that I called misogylinity, and I'm still hoping it catches on. But basically the definition of the term was a masculinity that is defined by the conquest, sexual or otherwise, of women. So I am masculine based on the kind of woman that I am able to conquer sexually, and that's what defines my masculinity. And I think it's an aspect or a facet of this template of masculinity that Asian American men, as well as African American men and Latino men, basically all men of color, have placed in front of them with their own masculinities as people of color or men of color, told that they're aberrant or abnormal in some way, and told that they're supposed to go seek this white heterosexual masculine center that is, straight, that is macho, that is this sort of testosterone frat boy guy, and I feel like for decades now we've been having this conversation about how can we get the Asian American guy to be just as like masculine and macho as the white guy, and what we don't do is we don't ask, well, maybe there's a problem with our definition of masculinity in the first place. Maybe that definition of masculinity is highly sexist, and maybe what would be the most progressive and radical thing to do in order to create an Asian American masculine identity that works for Asian American men is to redefine masculinity in and of itself. And Juliet, actually, I know I cut you off, so.
Oh, no. I was just going to say, like, all of this is a perfect transition to, like, what you and I love talking about. And I know Trung is very familiar, and Trung and Kate are both familiar with it. Like, bad, bitter Asian dudes who kind of, like, take the accumulated anger and bitterness of whatever it may be, whether it's entitlement, territorialness over like an entire demographic, or just fear of rejection, whatever it may be, and they channel it towards just being sexist and misogynist, and just kind of like, excuse my language, just completely shitting on Asian women, and
it's okay. It's okay to cuss. Yeah. I cuss like a sailor. It's okay.
Yay! And just like using us as some way to prop up the male ego. And that might be a strong statement, but I still stand by it just because I've had too many instances of people trying to break my ego with lovely messages in my inbox.
Yeah, queer Asian men do this a lot too. Like, oftentimes I find that I tend not to be able to participate in conversations about gender in terms of like representing or in reference to masculinity in my Asian Americanness, because like I'm a queer Asian man, I'm somehow a threat to this like paradigm of masculinity that Asian American men and masculinity kind of aspire to achieve, and so this is sort of a little bit new for me too.
Actually, Trump, that's something that I wasn't really aware of, and maybe it's just my own naivete. I never really thought about it. So, are you saying that as a queer Asian American man, you feel as if there's just trying to bring up queer issues or queer identity is also seen as threatening in some way to like the BAD? I'm just asking because like I didn't even.
Yeah, no. In my experience, yes, and it has to do with like. So like oftentimes the situation will go that like on paper, yes, queerness is okay, but there's a performance of masculinity that's expected at the same time. It's very strange. And so it's almost like there's this, and I don't want to spend too much time in it, but there is a sense of exoticizing Asian male beauty in queer men's circles as well. Like there is that kind of exoticizing that will happen. But not in the same way. Like, well, I'll experience something like sexualized racism, sure, but I won't experience something that Asian women experience, like racialized sexism, which is an entirely different thing. So yeah, those conversations have a tendency to get muddied up or stopped very early on because there is this, you kind of get shut down depending on what your performance is or what your presentation is like.
And I wonder if maybe it comes back to this idea from the Bitter Asian do, which I also didn't know there was an acronym for a really long time. But perhaps one thing that I've bumped into coming from this subset of Asian American men is that there's a sort of very specific expectation about the role of Asian Americans in general in trying to create this image of the race as masculine, to reclaim our masculinity through, I would guess, being the scab in every aspect of your life. And so I think this is where the pickup artistry movement really picks up on undercurrents within the Bitter Asian Dude, that this is something that you need to do, and you have a responsibility to the race in order to prop up masculinity. And then on the flip side, there's an expectation that the Asian American woman has a responsibility to use her sexual choices in a way that will confirm or validate the sexuality of Asian American men. So in both cases, you have what I think is sort of this muddying of the waters of what is personal and political. We talk about the personal as political, but I almost feel as if there is an expectation that my personal becomes fodder for your politic. And one of the things that I really love, Trungles, in the conversation that you and Juliet had was when you said, the bottom line is that when our intimacies are taken from us, that's our agency taken away. But on the flip side, in the Asian American feminism conversation that Juliet and I had, I believe it was Lisa Fectora-Borchers tweeted in, and I'm doing this from memory, so I apologize if I misquote, but I believe she said something along the lines of, who we love can be insightful into our politics, and therefore the personal is sometimes political. And so one thing I see in the tension about interracial relationships and the conversation we have over it is, where's the line between what is personal and what is political? Where do we allow our lives to be part of our politics, and where are we maybe sacrificing our agency or someone else's agency in order to try and create this larger politic that is new masculinity or new femininity?
Yeah, like in response to that, like I just have like so many more questions. It's kind of like, are we supposed to, like, if we are in an interracial relationship, do we suddenly carry the weight of having to educate that person? And then it's like, sorry, I'm still getting over a cold right now. But it's like, do people automatically assume that both parties in that relationship are unaware of the power dynamics and the stereotypes and the kind of stigma that's carried by them just by existing in that relationship? And I think Trung and I were also talking about this in the last conversation we had about interracial relationships. It's just kind of like the autonomy of it all. Like, I totally agree with Lisa in that it is definitely a window into your own personal politics. When I was dating someone who was not of Asian descent, we would have like really long conversations about the power dynamics and whether or not I was a fetish, whether or not I was like some kind of like rare occurrence in his life, or whether or not he had like either conscious or subconscious ideas about how I was supposed to behave, or the kind of person I was just based on who I am of my ethnicity. So just more questions.
Yeah, and I think to clarify, that conversation that Juliet and I had was very like, we were sort of venting our frustrations as well. Like, yeah, honestly, I don't actually think that there's not really a line that can be drawn between what is political and what is personal. Like, we are political necessarily because there is like social mores and there are legislations and there's lots of kind of different machinations that are affecting our personal lives. And so, like, whether or not we're in denial of it, whether or not we want to get away from the conversation, we really can't help being politicized. That's what being marginalized is. It's that your identity is up for some kind of debate. Somebody thinks of you in theory before you are a person.
It's going on Twitter.
Well,
you're doing me a lot, Julie.
So I agree with you. I agree with you to some extent, but I'm actually also going to take the alternate point that I think that for a long time, as you pointed out, people of color have had our voices co-opted, our narratives co-opted, and we've been sort of forced to not have agency over our personal lives based on this assumption that everything that we do is political. Like, if I enter the room, the whole room enters with me. That is part of the politic, but it's also a burden of the person of color, right? Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that I really wonder is, whether or not we are now sort of replicating or reinforcing that cycle of putting everything of our lives up for a kind of judgment and a debate. And I'm not even saying that you can't judge or debate or question, but I'm saying, like, what happens when we see a couple that sort of surprises us or confuses us, and we make assumptions about that, and we assume that that's all right. To for example, Juliet brought up the question, the idea of having are you the Asian fetish question when you see a white male Asian female couple, and there's always an assumption that if you see that couple, that one of them must be fetishizing the other. And yet, how do we know that for sure? Do I have a responsibility, if I were in that relationship, to let everybody know that I've had that conversation with my partner, that we've come to a place about it, that we're not fetishizing, that we're doing this consciously? And at some point, does that not become its own burden, that every time I'm walking down the street, simply because I'm in an interracial relationship and I've made that choice, that I have to explain that to you?
You're like, how long have we lived as a living, breathing teaching moment?
Yeah, it turns my life into a teaching moment every time, and also in a way that, I'm coming at this from a different perspective also, because we sort of started this conversation about, not assuming that it's white male and Asian female, and now we're doing that. My partner is African American, and one of the things that really frustrates me about the debate is that we assume it's always between a white male and an Asian female. And so one thing that uniquely I experience is that I'm considered one of those abnormal interracial couples, because you don't really see African Americans and Asian Americans together all that often, and you still don't. And so one of the things that we really deal with as a couple is that we're sort of this, interracial oddity. And so people always want to have the conversation, are we both fetishizing each other because we're both living under these hypersexual stereotypes? Have we had the conversation? Can we talk about what it's like to be this particular combination? And, after 15 years of that, it does get kind of tiresome to, basically have it be justified that my entire life is a teaching moment for you. So I feel like I say stuff and then y'all are just quiet.
It just looks like you sum it up so perfectly.
KJ, go.
I can also say
go,
that,
KJ, go.
Yeah. I can also say that in today's society, there's also the introduction of Korean culture to a lot of people. So now there's this issue of fetishization of Korean culture and Korean males, especially. My roommate, David, he actually was on Tinder before he moved out. And he had met two girls. He had met two girls that have actually strictly sought him out because he was a Korean male. Mm. And at first he was like, oh, this is great. Like, there's two girls that just want to like see me because I'm Korean. And I was like, all right. They're probably something called Korean booze. He was like, what's that? So he later on went on the date, came back, and I said, how'd it go? And he goes, they asked me about Korean pop stars and bands and stuff the whole time, and I don't know anything about it. So, like, in today's age, it's very different as a Korean male to see this happening. And I'm sure a lot of Korean males are like, oh, yes, finally, someone actually likes us for who we are. But in fact, it's just objectification of our culture, and just watching basically K-pop dramas and wondering if any Korean guy is like that in real life, which most times, no, they're not.
But isn't that kind of like
its own objectification?
Yeah. I mean, just what you said. I mean, isn't that fetishism just another kind of fetishism now, targeting Asian American guys, or specifically Korean American guys? So I think we're seeing just a cycle of, we've been dealing with the sort of the after effect of the model minority stereotype with the emasculation of the Asian American male, and now it's coming full circle again, and perhaps now it's become a different kind of objectification or hypersexualization, perhaps. I don't really know.
It's kind of a complicated objectification too, because in regards to Asian men, it's not Asian American men specifically. It's Koreaboos and Weeaboos. It's Japanese men and Korean men, and so there's this double-edged sword of it being like, oh, we're going to fetishize you for your race, but with the stereotypes of a culture from which you are the hegemony. So it's not Asian American men. Like,
okay, so it's more like a perpetual foreigner thing.
Projected onto Asian American men, but like a lot of those like your friend, like your roommate wasn't aware that there was this Korea blue sensation thing happening among like American girls.
No, he wasn't. He wasn't at all.
Yeah,
he just went to Northwestern University like a good student, and then just graduated. He worked as a marketing analyst and like started exploring Tinder, and he just came across these people.
Yep.
So this is this year. This is this year that this happened. So
yeah, and I feel like it's like an interesting turn of like how this conversation is gonna go, because it's like I feel like there's been this weird tension whenever we talk about interracial relationships too, about like a lot of hetero Asian men will kind of be like, well, you have the better stereotype because it's better to be wanted and desired, even if it's being fetishized, rather than be like us, where it's like undesirable, whatever. But now that that's kind of happening, yeah, Trong, I see that face, and that happens.
I'm making the face too, man. I'm like, okay.
And it's just like interesting how it's like this fetish for like Korean men specifically is happening. It's kind of, I'm excited to see where the conversation goes. So partly so I can sit back and be like, now you understand how it feels.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Bitter Asian Dudes has spent a lot of time talking about this idea of the good stereotype and trying to assert this Asian American female power that we have, that we're either able to have a political power because we are the desired sexual identity or gender identity, or that we are trying to sell out our race in order to appropriate or adopt whiteness, and that we have this power to sort of shift racially through our sexuality. And I find the whole thing just fucked up, personally.
Yeah.
But Trung is giving that look like, what?
Well, I just think it's super interesting that the different ways that discourses on power exist within Asian American circles, depending on like whether it's Asian American women or Asian American men. Because Asian Americans in general, like we have like the conversation that we have about Asian American masculinity is so centered on like being able to partake of hegemonic masculinity in the United States, and of course that has to do with whiteness. But from the perspective of Asian men who, like these bitter Asian dudes who feel entitled to the attention of Asian women or to Asian women in general, like them having no agency, is that they see power as how close you get to whiteness, and that Asian women have access to whiteness through the sexual avenue, which is super misogynistic, but also incredibly white supremacist.
Right, and I actually also want to tack on to that some of the pickup artistry phenomenon, which I will admit is a very extreme fringe part of this, but the idea is to train Asian American men to further pursue whiteness through the sexual conquest of women who are ranked based on perceived physical appearance and attractiveness, and where at least on some of the programs, where the white woman is considered the pinnacle of masculine achievement. So you're supposed to work your way up, and then when you are able to conquer whatever, sexually or otherwise, however you do it, flirtation, whatever, a 10 who's also white, then that is your sign that you've basically arrived as the Asian American male. And KJ is giving this look like, what are you saying?
I want to hear about this.
It's just funny to me because all I'm picturing at this point is, oh well, I did it. That's it. I got a 10, so I can just stop now. Like
we have arrived. Racial equality, right?
I have arrived. Like what?
So Trungles, you were like, what is this a thing? You knew this was a thing, right?
Yeah, well, yeah. Wait, which was a thing? What did I say that in response to?
Pickup artistry. Pickup artistry is a thing. Well, I brought that up because you were like trying to center yourself as close to, or try to position yourself as close to whiteness as possible. And it's not just for the Asian American women. Like, I think that the Asian American woman who's in, right? So they're in the interracial relationships is like, don't be with the white guy because, that's being a sellout. But then the Asian American man is, in some circles, encouraged to try and date out as a sort of a symbol of
oh yeah, I've seen the books. I've seen the books on Amazon. I thought they were a joke. But yeah, no, I wasn't entirely aware of like the seriousness with which people are like actually like encouraging Asian men through this whole like pickup artistry thing to aspire to date white women. Like that's really weird. Like
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
so I'm going to equivocate a little bit and say that it's not all programs. So I've learned a little bit about this enough to know that there are different people who sell pickup artistry programs to the Asian American community, and some of the more extreme versions have this sort of racialized hierarchy, and then some of the other ones will argue that they don't have a racialized hierarchy. They'll also argue that they're not advocating sexual conquest so much more as self-confidence. So, you know, it depends on the program that you're really talking about, but it's a sort of a thing at least.
Yeah,
and Juliet, you look like you wanted to jump in.
Oh, I was just kind of like face-pulling because like it's a rhetoric that I hear like not only like pickup artistry but also actually among like a lot of like, you know, Asian American like pop culture icons. I remember this. I just like Googled it because I couldn't remember what exactly happened. But I remember Kev Jumba actually posted something on Facebook about like, oh, you know, like white hipster guys, you need to stop like targeting Asian women. But then like his next post, like probably 2 seconds later, was like, but white hipster girls, feel free to come at us. Like we are here for you. And it was just kind of like that double standard. But it's also like, well, you literally just kind of called someone out for like objectification, like targeting someone for their race, but then simultaneously you're like, okay, well, I want that. Like white women they're the peak. They are exactly what I want. It's just kind of like reinforced over and over and over again by like a lot of kind of these like cult phenomena people in our communities.
And I wonder how much of that has to do with the aspirational model minority stereotype that we fit into, because all of this has to do with approval by white people.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like you're just dropping like nuggets of gold. Like
this is what happens every time I talk to Trungles. Like every single time, I was just like, when we were so the actual basis of that interracial article was just us chatting on Facebook about it and just ranting, and then like he would just like drop these one-liners, and I would just sit there and be like,
damn, I'm just not that smart, right? I'm just like not that
like,
smart.
Every time I talk about it, I just come up with like expletive, and just like.
But yeah, no, I totally think that, you know, I wish that we could have a conversation about it relating to the model minority myth and how I think that it is basically an internalization of the model minority myth, that we're supposed to try and, that again, the template for success, racial success and gender success and sexual success is still so tied with this white definition of what that is. And why aren't we having the conversations that says, hey, maybe there's nothing particularly inferior or abnormal about our definition of masculinity, our definition of femininity, our definition of sexuality. Maybe we already have it as a group of people, and the problem is that we keep trying to change who we are to fit into this other model because we're so trained to think that success comes from being closer to whiteness rather than closer to who we are as Asian Americans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I did tweet out this
article. I think that definitely stems from...
Oh. Go, KJ, go.
I think there's a lag. I think that definitely stems from the fact that everything in America is white-centric, meaning that most mass media, everything that's represented in America is pretty much white-centered. And that means, like, with that majority, with that power, they decide what their version of masculinity, their version of femininity wants to be. So it's, I would say that it's an uphill battle, definitely, for Asian American males and females to self-identify. For some, I feel like it'd be easier. For some, I feel like it'd be easier for them to just fit in with the mold. And I mean, obviously that is wrong. And whenever I like run the workshops on Asian male masculinity, what I hone in and focus on is that you should always try to carve out your own path and follow what you're passionate about and chase that with confidence, because that's like the one way that you can establish your own version of masculinity.
Yeah. And I think that I was saying the same thing in terms of the misogyny post that I wrote, that for me, when I think about masculinity, I would like for us to move away from one that is defined by heterosexuality and one that's not defined by sexism and misogyny, but one that's about self-confidence and about self-awareness and about, you know, intellect in a way. Just being being aware of who you are and being confident in who you are and letting that be masculine, having nothing to do with heterosexuality or women or all of these other ideas that are really put forward by hegemonic masculinity that we're basically told we're supposed to want.
Yeah, and I suppose, I mean, I don't want to, like, speak for all Asian Americans because I don't have a whole lot of access to, like, my particular ethnic cultural background all the time. Like, I do a little bit. But I feel like a lot of it has to do with dismantling internalized white supremacy within Asian Americans because there's so much of it. Like, in conversations about Asian American masculinity, we're trying to move away from this, like, effeminate area and move towards the center, this standardized white hegemonic masculinity. And then on the other hand, we're, like, maligning Asian women who go out with white guys because they're that much closer to, like, whiteness than the bitter Asian dudes. And then at the same time, we have the stereotype of, like, the scab, the sexy cool Asian bro, who is constantly appropriating AAVE, like, in an effort to emulate this sort of masculinity and appropriating, like, being anti-black in the same way that, like, white bros are. And so it's just, like, a lot of this, like, oh, how much of this, like, white culture can we take on?
I'm just, if I could snap, I would have just snapped too.
Yeah, I can only snap with one hand, so I'm actually just like faking a snap with this hand. I'm just kind of like rubbing my hand together. But
I feel like a lot of this is just because I don't get to have these conversations very much anymore because, like, I've graduated now and now I'm just like, oh yeah, I'm a cartoonist. What do I know? What can I tell people?
If only someone was running a bi-weekly podcast of Asian American issues. You know I'm emailing you. I'm like, Trungle, you're going onto the rotation.
Yeah.
But, you know, one thing I just sort of wanted to tie it back a little bit because one of the comments that we got on Twitter a lot, actually, was to talk about, you know, actually a little bit more of the practicality of being in an interracial relationship. We had a couple of people wanting to ask us to cover in the last few minutes that we were on the specifics of when you're in an interracial relationship, how that how you deal with, you know, the fetish question, whether or not you're part of a fetish question, and then alternatively, how do you deal with the culture clash? So those are more practical questions rather than theoretical questions. And I thought that maybe as a last couple of minutes, we could maybe just sort of talk a little bit more concretely about our experiences, whether or not we've been in interracial relationships, having the conversations. And I know that for me, when Lisa first asked that question about whether or not the personal is political, and talking about how you can really learn about your personal politics through whom you love. I think that's a really important thing, and I think that people who are in interracial relationships do have something of a personal responsibility to always be aware of the politics that surround your relationship. And I don't necessarily think that means that I have to share that with everybody, but I do think there's a personal responsibility associated with being reflective about my personal politic and what my choices in life mean and how I reconcile that with my actual political activism. And so when I have the conversation, and I've had the conversation about whether or not I'm participating in any sort of fetishism or objectification, but I've also only been in one relationship ever in my life, and it happens to be an interracial relationship. So I don't really have the experience of having had that conversation multiple times with multiple people. So I know, Juliet, you wanted to sort of touch in on the Asian fetishism question, and specifically how to have that conversation. And I wonder if maybe you might want to start us off on how to have that conversation, because I only, you know, I can tell you how I had that conversation, but, you know, that was on year 8, so I don't know if that's relevant to everyone else.
Yeah, so actually until this year, I have only been in interracial relationships, and it was kind of like the fetishism question was kind of like, I didn't start having it until I kind of like reached like social consciousness when I was like around 17 or 18. So before then, I was kind of like, you know, I don't look back on my younger years fondly, let's put it that way. Dated a lot of guys who were like, collected Japanese swords and read a lot of fusion, and there's just like a lot of just like, bleh. And it was just bad everywhere. And he would like only eat with chopsticks. So back then I didn't even have the ability to put into words my discomfort with it all. But my most recent relationship was interracial, and I think I mentioned before, but like I'm very fortunate that he was very political, very conscious as well, and we would just kind of like do these kind of like routine, not necessarily routine, but just like time to time we would check in and just kind of be like, you know, how are we feeling? Like, is there a power dynamic here? He did happen to be older, so it was kind of like, to the outward appearance, it was like, young Asian woman dating older white male. And he actually didn't even identify as white, so it was kind of like all these assumptions everywhere. But it was kind of like, obviously I'm very open with the kind of conversations and work that I do, so it wasn't really difficult to kind of start a conversation. It was kind of like, well, let's look at our relationship honestly, and maybe from like a third-person point of view. Are we healthy? Are we functional? Are we doing things because of stereotypes? Are we doing things based on prior assumptions and prejudices? Or are we doing this kind of like genuinely taking into consideration all the politics surrounding our identities, but then approaching it from like a, quote-unquote, like normal relationships view? And I think that Trungles actually had a really good way of having like the fetish conversation. I still remember that, even though our last conversation was like a year ago. Did you want to kind of expand on that?
Yeah, and I actually think that I might answer it a little bit differently now because I'm at a slightly different place, and I think I have no time for bullshit anymore because I'm so busy. Yes. So I just like cut right to it. But I think what I told Juliet was that I don't ask like, do you like, if we talk about fetishism, I'm never going to ask someone if they have a fetish. I'm going to ask them if they are a fetishist, because you can never separate the act from the person, because that's the entirety of your experience with them. So there's always that. But nowadays I always go by like, if you hear for like even a second somebody telling you that they appreciate your culture, run for the hills, because they already think of you in theory before they think of you as a flesh and blood person with your own individual interests. They're already more interested in thinking of you as like this like demure fantasy of the Orient somehow, and not as like, oh, do you like M&Ms or Skittles better? Like, it's just like, So that practical advice, if somebody says that they appreciate your culture, they're making a lot of assumptions, run away or like hit them or something. No, don't do that. I don't advocate violence, but like, it's a red flag.
KJ, did you want to jump in real quick? Because I'm pulling up a tweet right now. Or are you good? Are you passing on this one?
I'll pass.
Okay.
Oh, one question, actually. There's a question about Eleanor and Park, and I don't know a lot about that.
Oh, that's like the book version of a Korea boo. It was kind of like, as I remember, it was talked about a lot on Tumblr. If I recall, the author is a white woman who kind of just reduces the character of Park to this like really shallow, superficial depiction of like the sensitive, perfect, pretty much like a character from like a Korean soap opera. But in a book form for young adults, so it's kind of like the.
Oh, so obviously he's going to have some kind of white feature, right?
Yeah, it's like. Oh,
wait, did he? I was kidding.
I haven't read the book, and I don't really care to, but based on the conversation about it, yeah.
That's the second pop culture thing. I have no idea what's going on, so I feel really out of touch.
I don't know what's going on with it either, so I don't.
So I just really, relative to our fetish conversation, just in the last couple of minutes, Arthur Chu, who is that Arthur Chu from Jeopardy, by the way, tweeted us and was asking, or actually just presented a different point, and said, I wonder if people always think it's a deal breaker if the partner says, yes, you are my fetish. And later on suggested, and I actually also wrote, I think it depends on the individual, on the relationship, on what they said. I know how I would respond, but that's just me. And then Arthur said, it definitely depends. Sometimes admitting a fetish is a step towards unraveling the complexity of one's own sexual, racial power dynamics and begins a conversation. And I think that that's an interesting counterpoint to what we've been saying, or at least what we had been saying fairly recently, which was, one time you've got the fetish, and that says a lot about a person, and I also agree with that. And I think that informs personally what I would do under those circumstances, and I'm thankful that I've never been in that situation. But I also think
it's really sad when you end up in a place where it's just like, oh, I would much rather they be open about their fetishes and then, be in denial. Like, that is a real legitimate concern.
Mm-hmm. But I do think that, we're all four of us people who are, largely informed on these kinds of issues, who have thought about this, who understand fully what fetishism is and how it relates to larger ideas of white supremacy. And I do think Arthur has a point. Like, what if we're talking about people who really haven't thought about this before, who maybe have never challenged their own fetishisms? Is it possible that it could really be a conversation starter, and and possibly not be a deal breaker. I mean, it seems sort of fatalistic to be like, you have a fetish, you're fetishizing me, we're done. You know, like what if that person could really grow out of that through the conversation with you? And maybe that's just my naivete talking, but.
I mean, I briefly tried online dating one time, and there were, you know, it's probably like 95% of the time they were like really obscene, terrible messages that were already super racist and sexist. But occasionally, like, it got to a point where I had this like cut and paste response, kind of be like, look, you're objectifying me, you're fetishizing me. Here's reasons A, B, C why that's not okay. And occasionally, someone would be like, oh my God, I didn't realize. You know, like, thank you for pointing it out. Do you have any resources? Because I wasn't aware of this, and I would like to learn more because I don't want to be a horrible person. So I think there is room for growth, but I think just me personally, having dealt with like so many weird fetishizing ex-boyfriends, I'm like Trung, I'm just kind of tired of the bullshit. And like again, like do we have to carry the weight of like being the person to educate them and like being the person to like have that conversation with them? Because as I think all four of us know, it's a very exhausting conversation to have.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, my string of past relationships is like, I've had this conversation before. Obviously, it did not work because I didn't say.
That's all.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it really does depend. Like, if you've never had the conversation before, and I don't want to like get too academic with it because there is a practical, functional place where people like don't have access to this kind of like conversation, you know, and like use all the words that there are lots of like little catchphrases that people don't know if they don't have access to, like you know, Ronald Takaki book or something like that. So there are practical conversations to have that don't center on the academia.
Right, and I think that love, the one thing that I've taken from the interracial relationship issue over the last 15 years is that it's a resonating issue. It's one that for a lot of people feels like the central issue to the Asian American community, whether or not it is, because it's one I think is so deeply felt by so many people. Like for Asian American women, whether or not you're in an interracial relationship, it sounds like people trying to take your agency from you or to judge you. And when you're an Asian American guy contemporarily, it strikes home because it hits the same chords as the feeling of emasculation, the racial pain and the racial angst that comes with feeling like you don't have power over your own masculinity or your own definitions of masculinity. So I think that whether or not you know, the Asian American interracial relationship issue is practically one that has a lot to do with how we form our identity, I think that it has become central because it's so personal. And there's no way to not have a personal, passionate opinion on it. And I think that's also why the issue becomes so contentious. I think that it can be very hurtful on both sides because I think it really strongly divides the community down gender lines in a way that leaves us always, I think, fighting against one another rather than combining together and finding a way that we can actually focus on the mutual oppressions that affect us all. And y'all did it again. I said stuff and then y'all were quiet.
Yeah, you have a habit of dropping like amazing truth as well. And just like I have this article pulled up because it's something that I occasionally like find once again like floating around the internet. But it actually quotes you, Jen.
What?
And yeah,
I got quoted somewhere?
Yeah, it quotes you from your article on Asian female outmarriage, and kind of like the last sentence I just want to share. It's like, unlike Asian American men, politically engaged Asian American women have always had to defend our downness with the Asian American cause in reference to the race of our significant others. And then further down, there's like something else that kind of like, I feel kind of like captures everything in a nutshell. And it just says, and it's like bolded, it's like, Asian men, American patriarchy is not a system that you are meant to survive in. So it's kind of like, I don't have anything truthful for me to like say and then leave everyone silent, so I'm just going to repeat everyone else.
Well, so that's been about an hour. There was one person who asked us to talk a little bit about culture clashes and in-laws, and I actually have stuff to say about that, but that would actually launch us into another 10, 15 minutes, and I don't want to keep you guys that much longer, so I will try to interact with that person on Twitter later on, unless people are super excited about personal stories.
Can I add one thing, though?
Sure, go ahead.
So, yeah, we didn't make this clear whatsoever, but KJ is actually my partner, too. So, even though we're both Asian American, we're of different ethnicities, so I actually for like cultural clashes, like dealing with in-laws, especially when we come from like a community that's so like rooted in like immigration status as well. You know, I'm like, I just downloaded some apps on like learning how to learn Korean, and I'm like asking my Korean friends like the proper etiquette for like meeting like traditional Korean parents, and I'm just sitting here I'm like studying. It feels like I'm taking another course, but that's just one thing that I do to kind of deal with it.
Well, maybe we have time. Go ahead.
Yeah, because there's like interracial dating, but then there's also interethnic dating within Asian Americans. Because one thing that's different about us compared to all other races is that a lot of other races have shared languages, but when it comes to our race, we have so many different cultures and languages that are intertwined in our race, because it's an all-encompassing term. Asian American means so many different types of people that it's, for us, we would even have to have a conversation about interethnic dating eventually.
It's another hour.
I think it's really interesting. I mean, I'm the person who will throw stats out because that's how I think about things. But you know, two pieces of information that really mean something to me when we talk about this issue is that marriage rates are going down in general in all communities for everybody. So just this generation is not marrying at the same rate that previous generations did. And also that within the Asian American community, the rates of racial outmarriage are actually falling and the rates of interethnic marriage is actually rising. So I think that the face of this issue is and should be changing. And again, I hope that it changes towards a broadened definition of what we're talking about as an issue, rather than to focus on this very rigid idea of white male, Asian female, cis hetero marriage issues that's all wrapped up in a stereotype of what we're talking about. I'd really rather we talk about the issue in a much broader sense, one that's inclusive of the multiplicity of identities that's within our diaspora, that includes different ethnicities, different sexualities, different gender identities, and even, you know, for me, selfishly, to have room within the debate to have a conversation about being in an interracial relationship that's not with a white guy. Because I mentioned on Twitter that for me the conversation has always been marginalizing, because the interracial debate within our community has always been about how do you deal with, you know, trying to get closer to whiteness, and how do you deal with being a race activist and dating the man? And I'm like, that has nothing to do with me. Like, really, dude, I don't even have a hook point on that conversation. And while I'm not saying that there's, you know, I understand the pragmatics of talking about white male, Asian female relationships, because that is the bulk of them, that doesn't mean that we need to limit our conversation there. In terms of culture clashes, I will say that I think that happens across the board, whether we're talking about interracial or interethnic. You know, every relationship has its quirks, and how do you find commonality between two different people? Like 15 years later, my partner and I are still having arguments about whether or not you wear shoes in the house, and we've come to the agreement that I don't and he does. So, you know, that happens. And I think that's not just an interracial thing, you know. So this person who wanted to know about how do we deal with a culture clash, I think that everybody's going to have a culture clash whether or not they're monoracial as a couple or they're interracial.
Yeah. I feel like it also takes on an entirely different dimension, because if it's between you and your partner, there are issues that you can iron out, but then there's always the community behind them as well, and like their family, and that always adds an additional layer. Yes.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, the person on Twitter really wanted to ask about in-laws, and I will say that one of the major issues that we didn't even talk about that's really fraught is how do you deal with interracial relationships when it comes to in-laws and your parents, and a generation that perhaps is not so forgiving about being in an interracial relationship. You know, I myself am not married, and I'm in a relationship with someone who's not Asian American, and this was a very big issue in my personal life. And what I find is when I talk to other Asian American women, this is something that's happening across the board. I haven't had a chance. Well, no, actually, I have had a chance to talk to an Asian American guy who was also in a similar situation, and it was also a similar issue, because he was expected to bring home, you know, a Chinese American girl to, you know, have little Chinese American babies with, I suppose. And that was also a problem. So, you know, I don't know, unless you guys want to say something about this real quick in like 5 minutes. No. I think it's a topic for another debate, really. Like,
yeah, definitely.
Yeah, like how do we deal with the parents? But anyways, I want to thank you guys so much. And does anybody want to drop a final nugget of sheer wisdom? Like things that we feel like we have to say? No? All right, then I'm going to go through the panel one more time so you guys can just really quickly plug your Twitter handles or your websites and tell us how awesome you are and where we can find you online. Starting with Juliet.
All right, so thank you so much, Jen, for having us on this conversation again. I love your podcast because we can just sit here and talk for hours and hours. But you can follow me on Twitter. Please do. My handle is @Juliet_Shen. My blog is Fascinations. That's Fascinations with the word Asians. Fascinationsblog.com. And you can also find me at 18 Million Rising. The number's 18 Million Rising on Twitter. Yay!
Thanks so much, Juliet, for joining me again, and I hope that I can continue to have you on the podcast. KJ, do you want to really quickly give us a shout out to your Twitter?
KJ? I'm KJ. I am impartial to whether you follow me or not. I prefer to remain anonymous in most cases, so it's okay if I get follows. It's okay if I don't. I don't really mind.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, KJ, and I really appreciate your perspective, particularly in terms of the workshops that you're running, because I think it's a really important conversation to have, and particularly one that it's hard to have as not a guy, in terms of masculinity. So I really appreciate that perspective. And then finally, Trungles, I really want you to give a chance to tell us where we can find you on Twitter and maybe find your art, too.
Yeah, I'm Trungles almost absolutely everywhere. So if you were to actually just Google Trungles, it'll come up. And it's my artwork that'll come up first. My art Tumblr is artoftrungles.tumblr.com. Trungles is a personal Tumblr that I don't really post on a lot anymore. But that's typically where I tend to have difficult conversations with people about oppression. That's, yeah. But I don't really care if you follow me on Twitter. I'm ridiculous and kind of idiotic on Twitter.
And I just, I really want to give a quick shout out. Trungles' art is phenomenal. I am a huge Sailor Moon fan. And
I commissioned him to do my tattoo, so I permanently have part of Trungles on my body, so it's great. I got it.
So I really want to thank all of you guys for being guests on tonight's podcast. I think we had a really great debate, discussion about this issue. And also I want to thank all of the viewers who streamed this live. At one point we had 10 live viewers going on, and we had some interaction on the Q&A as well as on Twitter. I want to thank Juliet for live tweeting basically the whole podcast as well, because I have no idea how she multitasks that at the same time. I can barely talk and look at the screen at the same time. So, she's amazing. And also for everybody who is listening to this but then really needs to listen to it again, or somehow you are listening to this tomorrow in the future, you are able to download this podcast through iTunes. You'll also be able to stream it through YouTube. You can also subscribe to the Reappropriate podcast on the iTunes Store. And I would like to invite you guys to tune in next week, that's October 6th, when I'm going to be inviting back Caden Mack of 18 Million Rising for part 2 of our conversation on digital activism, focusing on digital activism as a decolonial tool for radical change. So thanks again for everybody for a really great conversation, and thanks to all of you guys for listening. We'll see you next week.